The manila folder landed in the center of the conference table with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than any shout. I was standing at the whiteboard, mid-sentence, explaining our quarterly projections to the staff when my brother interrupted me. "Actually, before we continue," Camden said, his voice steady and rehearsed, "there's something everyone needs to know." He slid the folder toward my end of the table. "Effective today, Megan is no longer employed with Riverside Printing." The words hung in the air like smoke. 12 faces turned toward me in perfect synchronization, their expressions a mixture of shock and confusion. I stood frozen, the dry erase marker still in my hand, my quarterly numbers half finished on the board behind me. This was our weekly leadership meeting. The same meeting I'd been running for 3 years. The same room where I'd presented the expansion proposal that doubled our revenue. The same table where my father had once promised me, "This business will always have a place for you." My mother sat at the far end, staring into her coffee cup as if the answers were floating in the dark liquid. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. I waited for someone to object. For my father to stand up and say this was a misunderstanding. For my mother to look at Camden with the same disapproval she'd given him when he crashed her car at 16. For anyone in the room to question what was happening. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Camden leaned back in his chair with the posture of someone who'd already won. His assistant, Brianna, sat next to him, her laptop open, taking notes as if this were normal business. Our production manager, Felix, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. I realized with sudden, cold clarity that this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't Camden losing his temper or making a rash decision. This was choreographed. They'd discussed this. They'd planned this. They'd chosen to do it publicly, in front of staff, during a meeting I was leading. The humiliation wasn't a side effect. It was the point. My hand tightened around the marker until my knuckles went white. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. Instead, I carefully set the marker down on the ledge of the whiteboard and looked at my brother. "I see," I said quietly. "Let me tell you who I am, because that folder Camden pushed across the table certainly doesn't. My name is Megan Caldwell, and I'm 34 years old. For the past 11 years, I've poured everything into Riverside Printing, the family business my grandfather started 40 years ago in a garage with one offset press and a dream. When I graduated college with a business degree, I came straight here. Not because I couldn't find other opportunities, but because my father asked me to. Help me build this, he'd said. Help me make it something we can pass down." So I did. I worked 60-hour weeks for the first 2 years at a salary barely above minimum wage. I redesigned our entire workflow system, cutting production time by 30%. I brought in our 3 largest corporate clients through cold calls and persistence. I trained half the people in this room. When my father's health scare forced him to step back 3 years ago, I stepped up. I ran this company while he recovered, kept every deadline, maintained every relationship. The expansion into digital printing? That was my proposal. The new facility we opened last year? I managed that project. But none of that is in Camden's folder. None of that matters now. I need to go back further, to the moment when everything began to shift. 5 years ago, my father stood in this same conference room, smaller then, before the expansion, and shook my hand across the table. We'd just closed our biggest contract, a 5-year deal with Morrison Medical that would triple our annual revenue. "This stays in the family," he'd said, his grip firm, his eyes sincere. "You and Camden, you're both going to build something incredible here." Camden was still finishing his MBA at Northwestern then. He'd call occasionally, asking about revenue numbers for some case study he was writing. He never asked about the actual work, the daily grind of managing client relationships or solving production problems. He was interested in the business as a concept, not a reality. But Dad spoke about him constantly. When Camden gets back, he'll bring fresh perspectives, new ideas. I didn't mind. I loved my brother. I wanted him to succeed. When he graduated and moved home, I was genuinely excited. Finally, I thought, someone who understands the pressure, someone to share the load with. I had no idea I was celebrating the beginning of my own erasure. Camden came back from business school with new vocabulary and bigger ambitions. Suddenly, our family printing company wasn't enough. It needed to be a multi-platform media solutions provider. Our clients weren't clients, they were strategic partners in the value chain. Within 3 months, he'd redesigned our logo, created a new mission statement, and started talking about scalable growth models. Dad loved it. Every dinner became a business strategy session where Camden would present some framework he'd learned, using terms like vertical integration and market penetration. Mom would nod enthusiastically. I'd try to contribute, mentioning actual client feedback or production challenges, and Camden would smile condescendingly. That's operational thinking, Meg. I'm talking about strategic vision. The phrase "the future" started appearing in every conversation, and the future was always Camden. Camden represents the future of this industry, Dad would say. We need his fresh perspective to stay competitive. I was 30. Camden was 26. Somehow I'd become old news, stuck in operational thinking while my younger brother represented innovation. You'll work closely with him, Dad told me one evening. Support his transition into leadership. Support. Not collaborate. Not partner. Support. The word settled in my stomach like a stone. The changes started small, almost unnoticeable. One morning, I logged into our accounting software and found my access had been restricted. I could see our current month's data, but not historical reports. When I asked Camden about it, he'd been named Chief Operating Officer in a restructuring I'd learned about via email. He waved it off. Just temporary, Meg. We are implementing new security protocols. I'll get IT to fix it. But IT reported to Camden now. The access never came back. Then my client meetings started getting rescheduled without my knowledge. I'd show up to a lunch with Patricia from Horizon Publishing, one of my oldest relationships, only to find Camden already there. I thought we could make this more efficient, he'd say. 2 perspectives in one meeting. Except afterward, Patricia would email Camden with follow-up questions, copying me as an afterthought. The gradual exclusion was masterful in its subtlety. Password resets I never requested. Calendar invites I wasn't included on. Decisions about my projects made without my input. When I raised concerns, Camden always had reasonable explanations. We are streamlining communication. We are eliminating redundancy. We are optimizing workflow. Every exclusion came wrapped in business jargon that made objecting seem petty. 6 months after Camden's return, the public undermining began. We were in a production meeting, discussing a rush job for Western Automotive. I'd worked with them for years and knew their preferences intimately. We'll use the £80 gloss cover stock, I told Felix, our production manager. They prefer the weight for their sales materials. Camden interrupted from across the table. Actually, we are moving away from the £80. The £100 presents better, and the cost difference is negligible. I stared at him. Western specifically requested. I spoke with their marketing director last week, Camden continued, not looking at me. They're open to premium options. Let's show them what quality really looks like. Felix looked between us, uncertain. So, £100. Yes, Camden said firmly. I could have pushed back harder, could have pulled rank. But this was in front of staff, and contradicting Camden would create a scene. So I swallowed my objection. The order went out on £100 stock. Western returned it, frustrated, demanding we redo it to their original specifications at our cost. A $4,000 mistake that Camden never acknowledged. But the pattern was established. Staff stopped bringing questions to me. They went to Camden first. My authority had been quietly transferred. The real turning point came during a quarterly review meeting with my parents. I'd prepared a detailed presentation about revenue distribution, noting that I'd brought in 70% of our new business over the past 3 years but hadn't received a raise in 18 months. Camden's salary, by contrast, had increased twice since his return. I framed it carefully, professionally. I showed spreadsheets. I highlighted my contributions. I asked for equity compensation, a formal ownership stake that reflected my role in building the company's current success. My father shifted in his seat. My mother folded her hands. Camden leaned back with a slight smile. "Megan, I think you're being a bit emotional about this," Dad said finally. Emotional. The word landed like a slap. "I'm being factual," I replied, keeping my voice level. "These are numbers. Documented contributions." "See, this is exactly what I'm talking about," Camden interjected. "This kind of intensity makes it difficult to have strategic conversations." I looked at my mother, waiting for her to defend me. She'd always been the mediator, the one who made sure both of her children were treated fairly. But she just sighed. "Maybe we should table this discussion. Everyone's a bit tense." That word, emotional, started following me everywhere after that. Every concern I raised was emotional. Every question was intense. Every request for clarity was difficult. I was being reframed, transformed from competent leader to problematic employee. 3 weeks ago, a calendar invite appeared in my inbox. Leadership update. No agenda. No context. Just a time and location, the main conference room. I almost didn't go. I'd been excluded from so many meetings lately that I assumed this was another one Camden had accidentally copied me on. But something made me show up anyway. Maybe intuition. Maybe just stubbornness. When I walked in, everyone was already seated. My parents at the head of the table. Camden to their right, Brianna next to him. Our senior staff filling the other chairs. The only empty seat was at the far end, isolated. I should have known then. Should have read the room, recognized the staging. But I walked to that empty chair and sat down, my notebook and pen ready. "Thanks for coming, everyone," Dad began, his voice formal in a way that made my skin prickle. "We are here to discuss some organizational changes that Camden and I have been working on." Camden and I. Not we, the leadership team. Not we, the family. Camden and I. "Before we get into the details," Camden said, pulling out a manila folder, "there's something we need to address first." That's when everything shattered. Camden slid the folder across the table toward me, his face carefully neutral. Inside was a single page, a termination letter on company letterhead, effective immediately, signed by my father. "As we restructure for the next phase of growth," Camden continued, "we've decided to streamline our leadership team. We appreciate everything Megan has contributed, but we are moving in a different direction." I read the letter twice, my brain refusing to process the words. Severance package. Final paycheck. Return of company property. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't break. I simply looked up at the room full of people I'd worked beside for years and asked, "How long have you known about this?" Nobody answered. Felix studied his hands. Brianna typed something on her laptop. My mother reached for her water glass, her movements slow and deliberate. "We wanted to handle this professionally," Dad said finally. "During business hours, with proper documentation." Professionally. They were firing me, their daughter, their partner, the person who'd built half of what this company had become, and calling it professional. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. Camden watched me with something that might have been satisfaction. He'd done it. He'd removed the obstacle. He'd won. Or so he thought. I picked up the folder and walked out without another word. At home that night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the termination letter until the words blurred. My phone buzzed constantly, texts from friends, calls from concerned staff members, messages asking if I was okay. I ignored all of them. Instead, I went to my home office and pulled out a cardboard box I'd stored on the top shelf of my closet. It contained files from my first years at Riverside, back when we were still figuring out systems and structures. Old employee handbooks. Training manuals I'd written. Client contracts from when we were landing our first major accounts. And at the bottom, in a worn accordion folder with fraying edges, was a binder I'd almost forgotten about. The label read, company formation documents, operating agreement, original. I'd been 23 when Dad asked me to file these after our attorney meeting. I'd read through everything carefully, made copies for my records, and stored the originals in the company safe. This was my copy. I opened the binder and started reading, scanning clauses I'd seen once years ago but never thought about since. Standard operating procedures. Dissolution terms. Management structure. Then, buried on page 8, I found it. Section 4.3, Equity Distribution and Sweat Equity Provisions. The clause stated that any family member who contributed more than 2,000 hours of documented work annually for 5 consecutive years earned automatic equity stakes in the company, proportional to their contribution percentage. Those stakes vested immediately and couldn't be dissolved without majority shareholder consent. I read it 3 times, my heart pounding. Then I pulled out my old work logs. I'd kept meticulous records for years, partly out of professional habit, partly because Dad had always emphasized documentation for tax purposes. 2,000 hours annually was roughly 40 hours a week for 50 weeks. I'd worked far more than that every year for the past 11 years. The math was simple. I'd earned equity. Significant equity. Potentially controlling interest depending on how the percentages calculated. My name should be on ownership documents. I should have voting rights. I should have decision-making authority that couldn't just be terminated with a folder and a letter. The question was whether Camden knew about this clause. Whether my parents remembered it. Whether the original agreement had ever been amended. I grabbed my laptop and started making phone calls. The first was to Amanda Richardson, a business attorney I'd met at a networking event last year. "I need a consultation," I said when she answered. "Tomorrow if possible. It's urgent." Amanda's office was downtown, a sleek space with glass walls and minimalist furniture. She greeted me warmly, offered coffee, and settled behind her desk with a legal pad. "Tell me what's happening." I walked her through everything. The gradual exclusion. The public termination. The operating agreement clause. I showed her my copy of the original documents and my work logs spanning 11 years. Amanda read in silence for 20 minutes, occasionally making notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. "Has this operating agreement ever been amended?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't seen any updated versions, but I've been excluded from a lot of meetings lately." "Do you have access to current corporate filings?" "Not anymore." Amanda tapped her pen against her legal pad. "Okay. Here's what we're looking at. If this agreement was never properly amended, and amendments require all parties' signatures, then this clause is still active. Your documented work history would give you significant equity, potentially 30 to 40% of the company based on these contribution calculations." My breath caught. That much. That much. Which means your termination might not be legal. You can't fire an owner without cause and due process. She paused. "The question is, why didn't your family honor this clause?" I thought about all those conversations about my future in the company. The promises. The vague assurances. The way equity was always something that would happen eventually. "Because they forgot," I said slowly. "Or they hoped I wouldn't remember." Amanda scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week. "I need to do some research," she explained. "Check corporate filings, see if there are any amendments on record. Don't contact your family yet. Don't make any moves. Just document everything that's happened and let me build the case." I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt since that conference room humiliation, hope. Not the naive kind, but the solid kind built on facts and law. For the next 5 days, I focused on documentation. I compiled every email, every project file, every client communication. I created spreadsheets showing revenue I'd generated, clients I'd brought in, projects I'd managed. I built a timeline of Camden's return and how systematically I'd been sidelined. Then, on day 6, something unexpected happened. Camden made a mistake. I was checking my personal email when I saw a message from Preston and Associates, an investment firm. The subject line read, Riverside Printing Investment Opportunity. I'd been copied, accidentally clearly, on a thread where Camden was soliciting outside investors. He was representing himself as the sole owner and CEO of Riverside Printing, promising equity stakes in exchange for capital. The problem? He wasn't the sole owner. Even without my claim, my parents still held majority stakes. Camden didn't have authority to negotiate investment deals on his own. I read the email chain 3 times, my pulse quickening with each pass. Camden had sent detailed financial projections, company valuations, and proposed investment terms. He'd described Riverside Printing as a founder-led company under his visionary leadership. He'd claimed decision-making authority he didn't have. And he'd copied someone he shouldn't have, Patricia Ford, an attorney at Preston & Associates who also happened to be the sister of my friend Claire. Patricia clearly recognized the potential problems. Her most recent email, sent just this morning, was carefully worded: "Before we proceed, we'll need verification of ownership structure and authority to negotiate equity arrangements. Please provide current corporate filings and shareholder agreements." Camden's response, sent an hour ago: "I'll have my attorney send those over this week. Everything's in order." Everything wasn't in order. Camden was misrepresenting ownership, potentially committing fraud, and doing it in writing with lawyers who would document every false claim. I forwarded the entire thread to Amanda with a simple message: "Does this change anything?" Her response came within minutes: "Meeting tomorrow. 9 Uhr morgens. This changes everything." That night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from clarity. Camden's arrogance had handed me the evidence I needed. He'd overreached, made claims he couldn't back up, and done it in a way that created legal exposure. All I had to do was wait. The next morning, Amanda was already at her desk when I arrived, 3 coffee cups scattered around her workspace. "I spent half the night researching corporate filings," she said without preamble. "The original operating agreement was never amended. It's still the active governing document. Your equity claim is valid." Relief flooded through me. And the investment emails? That's where this gets interesting. By misrepresenting ownership to potential investors, your brother has created liability for the company. If Preston & Associates invested based on false information, they could sue. The board, which includes your parents, could be held responsible. She pulled out a thick folder. "Here's my recommendation: we don't go after him directly. We inform the board of both issues, your equity claim and his unauthorized negotiations, and let them handle it. They'll either honor your ownership rights or face a lawsuit they can't win." "Why would they choose to honor it?" I asked. Amanda smiled. "Because fighting it costs money, creates bad publicity, and exposes Camden's actions to scrutiny. Because you have documentation they can't dispute. And because losing means you gain even more, including damages, legal fees, and public vindication." She was right. This wasn't about revenge. It was about facts. What do I need to do? Wait for them to make the next move. Camden's investor discussions will fall apart once they ask for documentation. Someone will realize the problems. When they do, we'll be ready. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Felix called me. "Megan, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but people are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About Camden's investor meetings. About ownership percentages. Patricia Ford's office reached out to our accountant asking for corporate filings, and nobody can find any amendments to the original operating agreement." He paused. "Everyone's confused about why you were terminated when the original documents list you as a stakeholder." Word was spreading. Staff who'd witnessed my public firing were now seeing inconsistencies they couldn't ignore. 2 hours later, Brianna texted me, "I need to talk." Coffee. We met at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between my apartment and the office. Brianna looked uncomfortable, stirring her latte repeatedly without drinking it. "I never felt right about how they handled your termination," she began. "I didn't say anything because Camden's my boss, but..." She pulled out her phone and showed me messages. "He's been asking me to backdate documents. To create memos that show you were underperforming. He wants paper trails that justify firing you. My stomach tightened. Did you do it? No. That's why I'm here. I'm not risking my career for his ego. She slid a USB drive across the table. Copies of everything he asked me to falsify, plus emails showing his actual instructions. I don't know what you're planning, but I thought you should have these. I took the drive, grateful. Thank you. People know you built this company, Brianna said quietly. Camden can pretend he did, but we were there. We know the truth. 1 week later, I received an email from my father. Emergency board meeting. Thursday, 2 p.m. Your attendance is required. Required, not requested. I forwarded the message to Amanda, who smiled when she read it. This is it. They've realized the problems. Should I be worried? No. They should be. Thursday arrived grey and cold. I dressed carefully in a navy suit, pulled my hair back, and gathered my documents. Amanda met me in the parking lot of Riverside Printing, carrying her own thick briefcase. Remember, she said as we walked toward the entrance, stay calm. Don't get emotional. Let the facts do the work. The conference room looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago when Camden fired me. Same table, same chairs, same slightly too bright fluorescent lights. But the atmosphere was different. Tense. My parents sat at the head of the table, both looking exhausted. Camden was there, his confident posture slightly diminished. 2 people I didn't recognize sat on the opposite side, a man and woman in expensive suits. Thank you for coming, Dad began, his voice formal. This is Howard Chen from Preston and Associates and Catherine Wells, our corporate attorney. We've uncovered some concerns that need to be addressed. Camden shot me a look that was pure venom. I met his gaze calmly and waited. Catherine Wells spoke first, her tone professional but pointed. During due diligence for a potential investment arrangement, we discovered that the company's ownership structure doesn't match what was represented to investors. Specifically, the operating agreement contains equity provisions that were never properly executed. She looked at me. Ms. Caldwell, according to our analysis, you have a legitimate equity claim based on documented work contributions over the past 11 years. This should have been addressed years ago. I wasn't aware, I said simply, which was technically true. I hadn't actively known until I reviewed the documents 3 weeks ago. Howard Chen from Preston and Associates looked distinctly unhappy. We were told the company was wholly owned by Camden Caldwell with minority stakes held by his parents. That representation appears to be false. Camden leaned forward. This is a technicality. The operating agreement is outdated. It's the governing document, Catherine interrupted. It was never amended. It's legally binding. She pulled out papers and slid them across the table, copies of the original agreement, highlighted and tabbed. My name appeared multiple times in the sweat equity clause. Based on Ms. Caldwell's documented hours and contribution percentages, she owns approximately 37% of Riverside Printing. Her termination without cause violates multiple provisions of the operating agreement and potentially constitutes wrongful termination. The silence was deafening. My father's face had gone pale. My mother stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Camden found his voice first, his tone sharp with barely controlled anger. This is ridiculous. Megan hasn't acted like an owner. She's never claimed equity. This is just what? Amanda said calmly from beside me, speaking for the first time. Just a legally binding contract that your family chose to ignore? Just documentation that proves my client has been systematically excluded from a company she partially owns. She placed her own folder on the table. We have extensive records of Ms. Caldwell's contributions, her work hours, revenue generation, and client acquisition. We also have documentation of her exclusion from decision-making, restricted access to company systems, and ultimately, her wrongful termination. Camden's jaw clenched. You can't prove any of this. Actually, we can. Amanda opened her folder, revealing the stack of evidence I'd compiled. 11 years of work logs. Client contracts with Ms. Caldwell's signature. Project files. Email chains. And most interestingly, communications showing you soliciting investments under false pretenses while simultaneously attempting to have documentation backdated to justify her termination. She slid Brianna's USB drive across the table. Camden's face went from red to white. My father closed his eyes. Howard Chen made a note on his legal pad and stood. Preston and Associates is withdrawing from investment discussions pending resolution of these ownership disputes. Ms. Wells, my firm will be in touch regarding potential misrepresentation claims. He left without another word. After Howard Chen's departure, Catherine Wells took control of the meeting. Given the circumstances, I'm recommending the board take the following actions. She listed them methodically: acknowledge my ownership stake, reinstate me to the board with full voting rights, and conduct a comprehensive review of Camden's unauthorized activities. Additionally, she continued, looking at Camden directly, I'm recommending suspension of Camden Caldwell's executive authority pending investigation into the investment negotiations and document falsification requests. Camden exploded. You can't be serious. This company was failing before I got here. I'm the one who brought in new systems, new strategies. You brought in false representations to investors and attempted to fabricate evidence against a partial owner, Catherine said flatly. That's not leadership. That's liability. She turned to my parents. As majority shareholders, this decision is yours. But I'm advising you that fighting Ms. Caldwell's ownership claim will be expensive, public, and ultimately unsuccessful. The evidence is overwhelming. My father looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Really looked at me, not through me or past me. Megan, I never meant. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. What had he never meant? To exclude me? To let Camden erase my contributions? To break his promise that this business would stay in the family, meaning all of us? I know, I said quietly. Because I did know. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He'd just let it happen anyway. The vote was called. My mother, my father, and me, the 3 board members under the original operating agreement. Camden wasn't on the board, I realized. He'd never actually been given that authority, despite his Chief Operating Officer title. All in favor of acknowledging Ms. Caldwell's equity stake and reinstating her board position. My father's hand went up first, slowly but decisively. My mother followed. My own hand rose. Unanimous. All in favor of suspending Camden Caldwell's executive authority pending investigation. 3 hands again. Camden stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. This is unbelievable. You're going to destroy everything I've built because she played the victim. You didn't build anything, I said, my voice level. You repackaged what already existed and claimed credit. You excluded me systematically, restricted my access, and when that wasn't enough, you tried to erase me completely. You made this happen, Camden. Not me. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than arrogance in his expression. Fear. Understanding. The realization that his actions had consequences. You always thought you were smarter than everyone else, I continued. But you forgot that intelligence isn't the same as wisdom. You got an MBA and thought that made you qualified to lead. But leadership isn't about vocabulary or frameworks. It's about trust, consistency, and actually caring about the people you work with. Camden grabbed his laptop and phone. I'm done here. He walked out, slamming the door behind him. The conference room fell silent. My mother was crying quietly, and my father looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Catherine Wells left after scheduling follow-up meetings to formalize the ownership documentation. Amanda gathered her materials, gave me an encouraging nod, and excused herself. That left me alone with my parents. The silence stretched awkwardly until my mother spoke. Megan, I'm so sorry. We never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said simply. You let Camden push me out. You watched him undermine me for years and said nothing. You fired me in front of my staff without even a private conversation. My father rubbed his face. Camden was so confident. So certain about what the business needed. And you? I was what? You were always here, he said. Always reliable. I took you for granted because I knew you'd stay. I knew you'd keep working, keep contributing, even when we didn't acknowledge it properly. The admission hung in the air. I'm not interested in taking Camden's position, I said after a long moment. I don't want to run Riverside anymore. My mother looked up, surprised. Then what do you want? I want to sell my stake. Fair market value, negotiated by my attorney, paid out over reasonable terms. And then I want to walk away. My father's expression shifted to something like panic. Megan, this is your legacy. No, I interrupted gently. This was supposed to be my legacy. But you gave it to Camden instead. You chose him. Now I'm choosing myself. The next 6 months were busy with lawyers, accountants, and negotiations. Catherine Wells handled most of the heavy lifting, determining fair market value for my 37% stake and structuring a buyout agreement. My parents agreed to purchase my shares over 3 years, keeping the business in their control. Camden resigned quietly, taking a job with a marketing firm in Chicago. We never spoke directly again. The staff at Riverside threw me a farewell party that was more celebration than goodbye. Felix presented me with a plaque that read, "To the leader who actually built this place." Brianna hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for not being like him." My parents attended, standing awkwardly in the corner, not quite sure how to act around me anymore. We were polite but distant. Some relationships, once broken, can't fully repair. I used the first buyout payment as seed money for my own venture, a consulting firm helping family businesses navigate succession planning and ownership structures. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. My first clients were families trying to avoid the exact mistakes my parents had made. The work was satisfying in a way Riverside never had been, because I was building something entirely mine. No shared legacy to maintain. No family dynamics to navigate. Just clean, professional relationships built on contracts and mutual respect. 1 year after that conference room confrontation, I opened my second office location. Today, I'm sitting in my own office, my name on the door, looking out at a city I've come to love. My consulting firm is thriving. I have a team of 8 people who respect my expertise without questioning my authority. I have clients who value my knowledge and pay me fairly for it. I have something I never had at Riverside, ownership, not just of a business, but of my own worth. Sometimes people ask if I regret leaving the family business. The answer is always no. I didn't leave, I was pushed out. But that push forced me to realize something important. Being valued means more than being needed. My parents needed me at Riverside. They relied on my work, my dedication, my consistency. But they didn't value me enough to protect my place in the business when Camden decided he wanted it all. That's the difference. Need is about what you provide. Value is about who you are. I learned that I can't force people to value me, not even family. But I can value myself enough to walk away when they don't. The original contracts told a different story than the one Camden wanted to write, but the real story wasn't in those documents. It was in the choice I made after everything fell apart, the choice to bet on myself, to build something new, to prove that my worth wasn't tied to their recognition. And that's the win, not the buyout, not the vindication, but the knowledge that I know my worth and I'm willing to walk away from anyone who doesn't.